Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Before we dive into today's video, I want to give a quick shout out to Aussie Striker, John Lindley, James Book, Jared Smith, Paolo Corradini, Phil Wood, Tina McCaffrey, and Elijah Scott. Those are our executive producer and producer level patrons. You guys support this channel and all of our patrons and every person who hits like, who subscribes, who leaves a comment for supporting this channel. I am grateful to you. We could not have this community without you, and I would not be able to do things like going to Belgium next week to make World War I content for the channel without your support. So thank you. If you want to look into becoming a supporter through Patreon, you can do that through the link in the description. It's also always showing up on the screen during reaction videos. All right, so today we're going to dive into the new extra credits series on the Easter Rising. I love diving into Irish history. It's not something I've done very often. I do have dreams down the road, a year or two, of taking the family to Ireland. We've got a lot of roots there. It'll happen at some point, and I'm sure I'll get into more history when I do. I confess this is an area of history I don't know a lot about, so I'm excited to learn. I'm excited to learn especially from some of you who do know a lot about this topic. I know we have a lot of followers in Ireland. I've seen the movie Michael Collins, which has Alan Rickman and a bunch of other big name actors in it, but that I think takes place after, in the aftermath of the Easter Rising. I know that Easter Rising's right in the middle of the Great War, World War I, and it's part of the move toward independence for Ireland. So I'm excited to learn. As always, the link's in the description to the original content if you want to check it out without my commentary. Let's go.
Dublin, Ireland, April 24th, 1916. Easter Monday dawns bright as Dubliners, both Catholic and Protestant, rouse themselves after a day of rest and worship. But some have barely slept at all, as they've spent the holiday making feverish, last-minute preparations. Now, they gather their courage, faith, and guns, and converge on Dublin Castle. As the party rushes the gate, the castle garrison is minimal and unprepared for an attack. The lone policeman on duty, an Irish Catholic who is unarmed, attempts to stop them, but to no avail.
Isn't that interesting that the first guy in the line of fire in this rising is an Irish Catholic? These are Irish Catholics who are primarily going to be fueling this, I would think. There's a lot of history here that goes back centuries and centuries, with England subjugating Ireland. There was a time when Scotland tried to subjugate Ireland. Now when you have Great Britain, they kind of create what we know today as Northern Ireland by sending a bunch of Scottish, basically migrants, over there and creating, it's called Ulster Plantation. And that's why you have the Northern Protestants, and then the rest of the island being primarily Catholic, is because they were coming over and intentionally trying to make Ireland more Protestant.
An attacker guns him down as he tries to close the iron gate. But by chance, the British Undersecretary for Ireland, Sir Matthew Nathan, sees this happen. So he, along with a few soldiers, scramble to the gate, slamming it shut and locking it as bullets zip by. Then they brace for a siege. For this is no isolated attack. All across the city, armed men and women are ambushing policemen and officials, taking up sniper perches, and raising barricades. The sleepy holiday is giving way to a revolution, an Easter Rising.
So this is just a couple of generations after the what we call the Irish potato famine, which we did a series on that, and I'll throw a link in the description for that if you want to check that out. And so there's a lot of bad blood here going back a long time. And some of it definitely earned. I mean, the Irish potato famine was a pretty intentional act on the part of the British government that very intentionally caused some real hardship and many deaths to Irish Catholics. And so these are probably the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who lived through that.
This episode is brought to you by the incredible value proposition that is the Curiosity Stream Nebula Bundle. Seriously, so much stuff under 15 bucks, I still honestly don't believe it. But more on that awesomeness after the episode. The Easter Rising is one of the most crucial events in modern Irish history. A rebellion that had been brewing for decades and sparked a period of conflict more ferocious and dynamic than anything seen in over a century. In fact, a bare 6 years after Nathan tried to close the gates of Dublin Castle to the unrest brewing outside, Ireland would be a republic independent from the United Kingdom. Now, it's easy to draw a straight line from the Easter Rising to independence. to tell the tale of a popular uprising against English misrule, full of tragedy, heroism, and defiance.
And I guess it's important to note, because the Easter Rising does fail. I don't think there's any secret that that's the case, because it takes another 6 years for independence. But this is very often the case, that there are people who are going to act and are going to feel like what they did was meaningless and pointless. But all it does is kind of sow the seeds for future success. There were times when you have people like John Brown, and say what you want about John Brown. In some ways, here in the United States, he was kind of a comparable figure, where he did something that was seen by a lot of people as being wrong and murder, and other people saw that as an act of defiance against an evil that needed to be rectified. And so you can see some parallels to that, and parallels throughout history. One person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. Just depends on which side you're on.
But while this series will talk about those things, we'll also discuss the gritty realities of how the Rising came about, what happened when the shooting started, and what changed when it stopped. All of which defy the straightforward narrative of the Republic's founding. Because, in truth, the birth of a nation is never simple. While the history of Ireland's relationship to Great Britain is complicated, the roots of the Easter Rising can be traced back to the rebellion of 1798, when a group called the United Irishmen staged an uprising against British rule. While this would-be revolution, which included a mixture of Presbyterian Protestants and Roman Catholics, was defeated, the pressures it created paved the way for two new Acts of Union. The laws that bound Ireland to Britain, just like an earlier Act of Union had bound Scotland and England.
And so this is where you go from, at the time the United States has its revolution, it's fighting against what? Great Britain. Great Britain is the island, the one island, if you're looking at the British Isles, it's the one on the right, it's Scotland, Wales, England. Now you're going to have the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Now today it's Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Chiefly, these abolished the Irish Parliament in favor of Irish representation in the British Parliament, which some hoped would increase Roman Catholic rights and allow them to serve in government. But progress toward greater Irish autonomy was slow. While there were still no uprisings to the extent of 1798, the Great Famine of the 1840s, which you can learn about after this episode in our series here, had a profound impact. With hunger killing 1 million Irish and forcing roughly another 2 million to immigrate, the famine both...
And as we've talked about in that series, Ireland's population is just now getting back to what it was before the potato famine. Between deaths and emigration, it set it back almost 200 years.
Both changed the face of Ireland and exposed the stark limitations and the frequent cruelty of British policy. A series of land reforms followed as efforts were made to stop the disaster from occurring a second time. By the 1870s, there were increased calls for Irish Home Rule, an idea that Ireland would practice self-governance within the United Kingdom rather than complete independence. This became the mainstream movement among Irish nationalists in the late 1800s.
And I believe that's what Scotland has today, right? I mean, it operates within the United Kingdom, but it does have its own parliament, things like that. I don't know exactly how much autonomy Scotland's parliament has within the United Kingdom, and I think maybe Wales has something similar in Northern Ireland.
And there was some progress. Irish members of parliament introduced 2 Home Rule bills in 1886 and 1893. But while both failed to get past the House of Lords, a third attempt succeeded in 1914. That was because, in the 1910 general election,
Shin
the
Fein.
pro-Home Rule Irish Parliamentary Party ended up with a powerful voting bloc. Now, we don't have enough time in this series to get into the entire tangled yarn basket of Irish politics and factionalism in the early 20th century. But broadly speaking, there were 2 opposed groups. The Unionists, who were content with Ireland's place within the United Kingdom, and the Nationalists, who wanted some form of independence from Great Britain.
And I believe that still exists today. I remember when the Queen passed away and the new king went to Northern Ireland, that there was a lot of talk, because I believe that the woman who leads the parliament there may be a nationalist who wants Northern Ireland to become a part of Ireland. And so it was kind of a touchy situation, because she was kind of speaking as favorably as she could about the monarchy while recognizing that she herself was not a unionist.
The nationalists originally believed in peaceful change, but by the early 1900s, a range of nationalist organizations advocated an uprising. But even among these militants, visions of independence differed. Some wanted Ireland to leave the United Kingdom, but remain in the Commonwealth and retain George V as king, while others wanted a complete break and the creation of an Irish Republic. There were also debates about what should be done with the vehemently unionist north of the island. Should it be incorporated or remain part of the UK? And many disagreed over the role of the Roman Catholic Church after separation and whether the new country should adopt the socialist or even communist ideas sweeping Europe. Then,
so you have people who agree on wanting independence, but lots of factions within that on how to go about it and what it looks like afterwards. And until you can deal with that and figure out, get your own ducks in a row, it's really hard to put a united front up. And you can see why some of these smaller groups are then going to want to try to fight. Because if they'd all kind of gotten together and been able to agree and support each other, they might have been able to push things through more peacefully. But that wasn't to be.
On the other side of that divided divide, the thought of home rule caused unrest among Irish Unionists, especially in the north, where Protestantism and unionism went hand in hand. Irish Protestants feared that even limited independence would result in the erosion of their culture or a purge at the hands of the nationalists. To combat this, Irish Unionists formed a paramilitary organization, the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF.
What could go
Within
wrong?
months, there were over 100,000 members willing to take up arms and defend their Britishness, whether the actual British government wanted them to or not. For instance, on the 25th of April 1914, the UVF successfully smuggled almost 25,000 rifles into Ulster. Predictably enough, the existence of this large Protestant militia worried Irish nationalists, who responded by forming their own paramilitary army, the Irish Volunteers. It seemed the board was being set.
So there's escalation happening among the civilian populace. You got one side saying, we're afraid of what's going to happen, so we're going to arm ourselves. And now the other side says, well, we're afraid of you and what you've decided to do, so we're going to arm ourselves. And it's only a matter of time before this results in violence.
For civil war. But as so often's been the case throughout history, just as conflict seemed inevitable, external events overturned the playing
World War
pieces.
I.
In 1914, an archduke died in Sarajevo, and Britain became embroiled in the First World War. Hundreds of thousands of Irishmen, Protestants and Catholics, nationalists and unionists, put aside their differences to enlist in the British Army. The UVF signed up in droves, forming an entire army division that would go on to fight across the Western Front. And with the war seemingly diffusing the tensions at home,
I wonder if that was the Ulster Division, the 36th Division, which has a beautiful memorial in at the Somme battlefield and fought incredibly well. I need to look that up. It was indeed. So it was an infantry division, part of Lord Kitchener's new army, formed in September 1914, originally called the Ulster Division. It was made up mainly of members of the Ulster Volunteer Force, who formed 13 additional battalions for 3 existing regiments, the Royal Irish Fusiliers, the Royal Irish Rifles, and the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers. Very cool. I did not know that was the origin of that division. That's good to know.
home rule went to the back burner. But not everyone shifted focus. For while many Irishmen supported the British war effort, some nationalists saw a world war as the perfect opportunity to strike.
Yep.
Both Ireland.
So while they're distracted, while they've got all their resources and all their money and all their military focused on the Western Front and on Gallipoli and on the Middle East and on Africa, now's our chance. I totally get that. That makes a lot of sense.
July 26, 1914. In broad daylight, a ship pulls up to the docks, met by a group of Irish men and women equipped with wheelbarrows and carts. Among them is Countess Markovich, the first woman to be elected to the British Parliament. Under her direction and the other leaders of the group, the ship starts unloading its cargo, 1,500 Mauser rifles. Markovich and those
German.
assisting her are Irish nationalists. With the Irish Unionist UVF now armed, thanks to their own gun-running operation, the nationalists are trying to keep up.
So they got German weapons, because obviously they're not going to be able to get Lee Enfields from the British government.
But the news of guns being taken away in wheelbarrows spread quickly, and police and soldiers mobilized to halt the illegal drop-off. A crowd gathers shouting, someone throws a punch, and a brawl ensues. Amidst the confusion, most of the guns make it ashore, disappearing under floorboards and into attics to be retrieved later. The Irish volunteers were now armed.
So this reminds me a little bit of the start of the American Revolution. How did the American Revolution actively get started? The British military was sent out looking for a stash of weapons that American militia had in Concord. And they end up running into that militia in Lexington. A shot gets fired, and we know the rest.
A revolt was simmering, and there was one group determined to make it boil over. The Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB, had formed in 1858 as a secretive, oath-bound fraternal organization dedicated to creating an Irish republic. It was one of the main backers of the Irish Volunteers, though it didn't fully control them, and was advocating for an armed uprising. And while rebellion was generally approved of, senior individuals of the IRB found themselves at odds with each other over the specifics. Some believed the time was not yet right for a rising, while others wished to press ahead. And unbeknownst to much of the IRB, a small militant faction within its own ranks, calling itself the Military Council, had tasked itself with planning the rebellion. The council kept these designs secret, not only from the authorities, but from other nationalists who might seek to delay it. Distrust and uncertainty were rife.
So, again, there's that division between the different nationalists. They're keeping this secret even from other nationalists who might not be as extreme, who might not be willing to take that step. Because there might be a lot of people who are in favor of independence, but they're not in favor of bloodshed to make it happen.
But this potential uprising was fraught with risk. British military power was overwhelming, even with troops stripped for the war. So some decided it would be wise to even the odds by winning some foreign backing. And now that Germany was at war
W2, Kaiser Wilhelm II. And that's a German soldier there.
with Britain, the country seemed like the perfect ally for the nationalist movement, and courting assistance from the Kaiser became imperative. To that end, Irish nationalist and former British diplomatic consul Sir Roger Casement was dispatched in secret to negotiate with the Germans in New York and Berlin. If he was successful, German arms and ammunition would flood Ireland, and German soldiers would land in the west of the country, then march on Dublin amid an open rebellion. So as Irish volunteer fighters took their rifles from hidden lofts, they were preparing not just to strike a blow for Ireland, but also for a German victory in the First World War.
So I knew that this all happened. I didn't know the German connection to it, which is fascinating.
And if you'd like to learn more about the
So, okay, I guess we're done with episode 1. Fascinating stuff. There's definitely a lot more to come, and we'll dive into those other episodes in the coming days. I don't know if the series is done. I know 3 episodes have come out. I don't know if there's more still. But I'm sure somebody can let me know that in the comment section below. As always, check out the links in the description to the other channels and to the ways you can support the channel. And we'll be back tomorrow with the next part of this. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everybody, to part 2 of our look at Extra History's Easter Rising. If you did not see part 1 of my reaction, there's a link in the description that will take you back to the beginning, as well as the link to the original content if you want to watch it without my commentary. As with all of the channels I do reactions to, I invite you to support them, give them a view, give them a subscription. Support those channels because they are teaching history in a very unique way, and we have the privilege of being able to use their teaching tools to talk even further in depth about topics. So I'm grateful for them. Folks like Extra History, there's a reason we do a lot of their stuff, because they have a great way of telling the stories, and they use some top-notch animation to do it. So we're going to dive into this. I am in the final stretch of my plans and my preparation for my trip to Belgium. I'll be leaving Sunday afternoon. Can't wait. Trying to get some research done. If you want to follow me on Instagram, if you use Instagram, you can do that. The Instagram link's going to show up here in just a second. It's also down in the description typically. But I'll be posting stuff every single day from my time there. So you get to see a lot of stuff you might not otherwise get to see. All right, let's dive into part 2.
The German Club, New York City, August 24th, 1914, 2 years before the Rising.
So just for context here, August 24th, 1914, we are just a couple weeks into the First World War. Germany invades Belgium, like I think on the 4th of August. So that's really, I mean, declarations of war have happened, but that's when action begins. So this is 3 weeks into the war.
2 groups of men file in and take their seats. The air tense with expectation. The First World War rages, the U.S. has yet to pick a side, and German officials in America are working hard to extend their country's influence behind the scenes. Today's meeting is part of that operation. One of the two groups consists of German dignitaries, an ambassador, a military attaché, a banker, and a journalist. Many of them are spies, working to disrupt ties between the United States and the Entente. And they are led by the cordial but unreadable Johann Heinrich von Bernstorff.
And it's also important to point out that a large chunk of Americans at this point identify as German American. It's actually the largest single group in terms of who people identify with as far as their ancestry goes, especially in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and the upper Midwest. A lot of German ties there, and a lot of people are heavily leaning towards Germany and the Central Powers. This is not a clear-cut thing where there's a good side and a bad side.
A Prussian count and ambassador. The other party considers themselves a diplomatic delegation, albeit for a state that doesn't exist. Yet, they are Irish nationalists, some American-born, but others from Ireland. The nationalists make their proposal. They want German assistance in defeating their mutual enemy, the British, and they ask for only two things: weapons and military expertise.
Interesting, and also it should be pointed out that one of the other largest groups of people in America would be Irish Americans, especially in big cities like New York City, Boston, places on the East Coast. So there'd be a lot of support for both of these groups in terms of them banding together against the British.
Von Bernstorff listens intently and promises to contact his superiors to see what can be done. Because if he can help raise rebellion in Ireland, the war could really be over by Christmas.
So if they could quickly, I'm just kind of thinking through this out loud, if they could quickly get a major rebellion going in Ireland, which I don't know how they'd quickly do that, because number one, how are you going to get large amounts of guns to the Irish when you've got the British Navy out there, which is the largest and most powerful in the world, and is probably more than any other factor going to be responsible for bringing the Germans to their knees in this war. But if you could do that quickly, yes, it would make a difference, because at this stage in the war, if Germany can break through the Allied line in Belgium, if they can get through to Paris, if they can quickly force some kind of settlement in the West before the British, it's going to take the British a year or two to get there in large numbers anyway. If the British are distracted at home, they're not going to be able to do that. But I feel like the opportunity is going to pass pretty quickly for that.
Thanks so much to World Anvil for helping us forge today's historical tale. Last episode, we explored the background causes of the Easter Rising and how politics, both in Parliament and the streets, led to the moment in 1916 where people went for their rifles. Today, though, we want to rewind a little bit and go back to 1914 to trace the web of spies and backroom operators trying to put those rifles into revolutionary hands. By the later half of 1914, preparations for an Irish nationalist uprising were already well underway. A shadowy faction of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, calling itself the Military Council, was forging ahead, hoping to strike while Britain was embroiled in a world war. But to succeed, the plotters knew they'd need help from overseas. Both Germany and America seemed like natural allies, the former because it was at war with Britain and would benefit from a revolt, and the latter because it contained a large Irish population which included militant nationalists. In fact, in the 1860s and 70s, an Irish-American radical group known as the Fenian Brotherhood had repeatedly invaded Canada as a way to pressure the British to leave Ireland. As a result, Irish nationalists traveled to the US hoping to secure funding from Irish Americans and support from German diplomats. Foremost among those operatives was Roger Casement, a former British diplomat. Casement had become disillusioned with the Empire and embraced the nationalist cause. On his visits, he met with both senior Irish Americans and German officials such as von Bernstorff.
So this is a really important ally to have on your side, somebody who's been in the British government so they understand how certain things work. They also have made a name for themselves. They're going to be familiar to people within the British government. So that gives some legitimacy to this movement. It also gives them some inside info, but also and maybe some back channels through which they can work to get what they want. I don't know how it's all going to shake out, though.
But progress was slow. So, in late 1914, Casement decided to go to the source. He traveled to Germany in disguise, narrowly dodging British spies along the way. Once in Berlin, he became one of several Irish nationalists courted by German nobles and diplomats, and through those connections, secured nominal backing from the Kaiser.
Who, let's not forget, Kaiser Wilhelm is the eldest grandchild of Queen Victoria. He is a nephew of, well, no, he's not, he's a nephew of Edward VII, who has now died. By 1910, then you get George V, who's Kaiser Wilhelm's first cousin. Their parents are brother and sister.
That done, he started a new project, recruiting a force of Irish nationalists out of Irish prisoners of war, captured while serving in the British Army. Casement visited POW camps in Germany, one holding 2,000 Irish prisoners, in hopes to raise a German-led and armed legion that could join the planned uprising. Yet his plea for Irish unity seemed to fall on deaf ears. Less than 60 men volunteered, and he abandoned the effort after, according to one American diplomat, quote, "The remaining Irishmen chased him out of the camp."
That's interesting. So these are guys that have been captured by the Germans in World War I, and he goes there expecting them to be in favor of this. But you got to remember, at this point, there's not really conscription. So if they're fighting, they're volunteers. And if they're volunteers, that means they were willing to serve the British Army. So a bit of a miscalculation on his part to think that these are the guys that are going to support your cause.
It was an ill omen, and not the only one. The Germans had supplied him with fewer weapons than he'd hoped for, and no military advisors. Disillusioned, in April 1916, Casement boarded a German U-boat and prepared to return to Ireland in hopes to put off the rising before it ended in disaster. Meanwhile, back in Ireland, matters were close to spiraling out of control. The IRB's military council had to keep its planned rising a secret.
So, he mentioned the U-boat there, and that was something when I said earlier, I wonder how they would get large numbers of weapons to the Irish. U-boats would be the way. There's no sonar, anything like that. So U-boat's a pretty safe way to be able to smuggle things to Ireland until the British get wind of it and then park some destroyers off the coast of these different ports to prevent it from happening.
Not only to avoid discovery by the British, but also to hide their plans from their own organization. The president of the IRB, nominally the council's parent group, didn't feel the time was right for a rising, a view shared by the commander of the Irish Volunteers, Owen MacNeill. But despite this, many Irish volunteer officers owed their loyalty to the military council and could be relied upon to fight if the military council called for it. And to add yet more daggers and cloaks to this cloak and dagger convention, there was a small nationalist faction, even more determined to stage an uprising than the IRB's military council. The Irish Citizen Army, led by former British soldier James Connolly, saw themselves as socialist revolutionaries and were planning a rebellion of their own.
So again, you've got different factions who want different things, right? You've got some who just want independence, some who want independence, but the new government needs to be socialist afterwards, and some are going to want independence, but let's determine our own fate. And so can you get those groups united long enough to achieve the goal they all agree on before they then fight amongst themselves about what comes next? That's a great question.
Knowing that disunity would invite destruction, the military council secretly reached out to the firebrand Connolly, inviting him to join them rather than strike out alone. To the council's relief, Connolly accepted.
There's an old saying, it's a little bit crude, but it's basically something to the effect of better to have them inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in, right? It's the idea of keep your enemies close, or keep the people you need to watch close. It's what Abraham Lincoln did. He put all of his rivals for the Republican nomination for president, all who thought they could do a better job than him, he put them on his cabinet where he could keep an eye on them, but he also recognized that they were important allies to have.
It was time for the next stage of the plot. On the 19th of April, 1916, the military council published a forged document that detailed British plans to arrest senior nationalists. The council then informed officers in the Irish Volunteers that the rising would begin Easter Sunday. Of course, nationalists with lukewarm views about the rising, like Owen MacNeill, were kept in the dark.
So again, to give some context to what's happening, this is April 1916. The Battle of Verdun is raging on the Western Front. France and Germany are in an absolute bloodbath outside of Verdun. In the meantime, by this point, the British are planning one of their biggest offensives of the war at the Somme. It's just a couple of months away, and so they've got their hands full with that, and then this is going to erupt right in the middle of that time.
But revolutionary circles are small, and a rising's hard to keep quiet. McNeil found out and panicked. He issued a countermanding order, instructing the Irish volunteers not to take part in the uprising. Chaos ensued. Irish volunteers had to choose whether to follow McNeil's orders or the military council. And amidst the confusion, some retrieved hidden weapons and prepared to fight, while others left them in lofts and barns, believing it would be better for the cause if they stayed at home. And on top of that, another drama was playing out at sea. Off the coast of Carey Island, Good Friday, April 21st, 1916. The German naval captain checks his charts. The maps are in Norwegian, and he has no radio on board. His ship, the SS Libau, currently disguised as a neutral Norwegian vessel, is deep in British waters. And within the Libau's hold, concealed beneath a cargo of timber, are 20,000 rifles, 1,000,000 rounds of ammunition, and 10 machine guns.
And this kind of stuff happened on both sides. That the British would do the same thing. They would smuggle in things like gun cotton, things like ammunition from the United States in the holds of ships like the Lusitania, disguised as neutral passenger vessels, so that they wouldn't be attacked by German submarines. So it was a pretty standard thing that was happening a lot.
They're the German Empire's contribution to the imminent rising, and while the shipment is smaller than the nationalists hoped, it still dwarfs the last gun running at Howth 2 years earlier. But when the ship arrives, there's no one to collect the guns. The captain is in the right place, but at the wrong time. Irish nationalists are expecting to meet him 2 days later. None are present along the coast to guide the German ship to shore, and the captain's worst fears quickly materialize. 3 Royal Navy destroyers appear on the horizon. They hail him, and he responds with his false identity. Thinking the Norwegian ship is lost, they escort the Libau into Cork Harbor. And knowing they'll be searched, the Libau's captain gives orders to place scuttling charges rather than reveal his cargo. After a series of thudding detonations, the weapons meant to ensure Irish independence sank into the depths within sight of Cork Harbor.
Had no idea.
That Easter weekend, it seemed as though everything that could go wrong had gone wrong for the military council. Confusion reigned among the rank and file thanks to McNeil's counterorder, and the desperately needed German arms and ammunition had been sunk. And to top things off, Roger Casement, who was supposed to link up with the weapons shipment, had been deposited by a German U-boat on the Irish coast. Ill from a recurring bout of malaria, he was found and arrested by an Irish policeman. Now, the local Irish volunteers might have attempted a rescue, but they were under orders not to make any moves before Easter Sunday in case it tipped the authorities off. Everything now seemed in doubt. Ironically, the British were aware of almost all of this. Not only had they successfully intercepted both Casement and the nationalist arms shipment, but the very idea of staging an uprising during Easter had been leaked to various senior sources.
The British have always been excellent at their counter-espionage efforts. I mean, they're the ones who discover the Zimmerman telegram and eventually turn it over to the Americans. They're the ones who do a lot of the work in breaking Enigma during World War II. It wasn't just the Americans. The Polish had a lot to do with it as well, and others. I mean, not the Americans, the Brits. But the British have always been very, very good at this. So this doesn't surprise me even a little bit.
And some historians have even suggested that parts of the British establishment actually wanted a rising to happen, as it would allow future crackdowns on the nationalist movement.
Yep.
But it seems, however, that most of the authorities were simply too slow to act on the intelligence they received. And in that sense, finally, the nationalists experienced some luck. The military council delayed the rising from Easter Sunday to Easter Monday, allowing them to meet and decide whether or not to go ahead with their plans. They voted on it and raised hands. They would carry on. One of their members, barrister, writer, and committed revolutionary Patrick Pearse, who 6 months earlier had delivered a speech to a nationalist crowd that had ended with the words, "Ireland unfree shall never be at peace," was elected president of the Irish Republic. Orders were to strike the following day. For better or worse, the uprising was going ahead, and the military council would now make certain that Pearse's words were no empty threat. The time for oration, negotiation, and deals in the dark was over, and the time for actions had arrived.
Interesting. All right, well, we see where this is going. I've been told that this is probably a 5-part series. Only 3 parts are out so far. I think part 4 will probably be out this weekend, which means part 5 will come out while I'm in Belgium, so I'll probably not get to the reaction on part 5 until I get back. But in the meantime, make sure you're subscribed and you have your notifications on. And I'd also encourage you to subscribe to the VTH Originals channel because I will be posting some things there that may not end up on this channel associated with my recent trip to the UK. So check that out. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, and welcome back to me. I'm back in my chair here in the loft at my house after a little over a week away in Belgium. It was a phenomenal trip. We are going to be doing a stream where I'll tell you everything about the trip, the highlights, the experience, what you can expect from content. Some of you have already seen some of the content. I've uploaded little clips from the battlefields around Ypres. There's a lot more to come, a lot more to be shared, including things from our Band of Brothers tour, 2 days exploring the sites of the Battle of the Bulge. But for today, I want to get back into the Easter Rising. This is going to be episode 3. If you did not see the first 2 episodes to my reaction, the link is in the description. It'll take you back to episode 1. I've also put the link to the original content so you can check them out over at Extra Credits. Let's go ahead and dive in to part 3.
Dublin, April 24th, 1916, Easter Monday. Sackville Street resounds with marching boots as a column of men pass down the major thoroughfare. Some wear green military uniforms, others civilian clothes, but all have guns. Yellow armbands proclaim them to be nationalist paramilitaries, the Irish Volunteers. And marching with them are their leaders, Patrick Pearse and James Connolly. The volunteers proceed to occupy the General Post Office, taking it as a headquarters and stockpiling arms and ammunition there. Then, Pearse reemerges, standing before the building, and reads out a proclamation from the Military Council. It informs the people of Dublin that an armed uprising against British rule is underway, and that this is the first day of a new nation, the Irish Republic. As Pearse reads, gunshots ring out across the city. After years of planning, the Easter Rising has begun.
So let's put this in context of what is happening for the British at this exact moment. They are in the final stages of planning one of the largest offensives of the First World War. The Battle of the Somme is going to begin on July 1st, 1916. That's less than 6 weeks away. They are well into the planning for this. They're getting ready for that. They're laser focused on getting that done, trying to make something happen on the Western Front. They're also fighting in many other places. So their hands are full. Their eyes are on other things, and this is happening in their own backyard.
Thanks so much to NordVPN for helping to keep us safe on the internet. To take control of your internet security with a 2-year plan that's on a huge discount right now, use code ExtraCreditsVPN at nordvpn.com/extracreditsvpn. Despite the chaotic last-minute preparations Irish nationalists made as they decided whether or not to go ahead with their planned rebellion, and how divided leadership meant that not all Irish volunteers were ready or even willing to take arms against the government, the Military Council put their plans in motion. Late in the morning on Easter Monday, 1916, nationalists in Dublin rose up.
So Easter Monday, what does that mean? Because, Easter's on a Sunday. I mean, this is the Monday after Easter. And so I know here in the States, and I'm sure it's probably that way in other places as well, when you have a holiday that falls on a weekend, typically if it's a holiday that involves a day off for a lot of people, like federal employees, like the post office, banks, things like that, usually they'll have the holiday on the Monday following that weekend.
After seizing the General Post Office as their sturdy walled nerve center, they proceeded to take other strategic and symbolic structures throughout the Dublin city center. And by early afternoon, the Irish Volunteers and the smaller organizations assisting them, such as the Irish Citizen Army, had captured St. Stephen's Green, Jacob's Biscuit Factory, the South Dublin Union, the Northumberland Hotel, Boland's Mill, and the courthouse known as the Four Courts. Another group, led by Sean Connolly, not to be confused with the higher-ranking James Connolly, occupied Dublin City Hall, then, as we saw in Episode 1, attempted to rush the gates of Dublin Castle.
So you've got a limited number of people. Your manpower is low, but you can be effective with low manpower if you seize key strategic points. Now, I don't know what this looks like on a map, but I would guess some of these have very symbolic value, but also some of them are probably in strategic places that give them maximum ability to control the expected reaction, because you have to expect you're going to get this surprise. You're going to get the jump on the British authorities, but you can expect that at some point there's going to be a reaction, that they're going to send in the military, and you need to be strategically placed to be able to put that off when it comes.
Connolly raised his gun and killed a policeman guarding the gates named James O'Brien. But the brief confrontation between Connolly and O'Brien meant that the British personnel inside the castle were able to slam the gates shut and keep the attackers out. O'Brien was likely the first death during the Rising, and by a strange twist of fate, his killer Connolly would fall to a British sniper's bullet shortly thereafter, likely the first fatality among the rebels. This was not the only sad irony that day. One of the first British soldiers the Nationalists killed was Lieutenant Gerald Nealon of the 10th Royal Dublin Fusiliers, an Irishman and a nationalist. But he was one of the many who had decided to put aside his political beliefs regarding Ireland in favor of serving the British Army during the First World War.
It reminds me a lot of the fact that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by people who wanted Serbian independence, who were Serb nationalists, and a guy like Franz Ferdinand within the Austro-Hungarian government was probably one of the more sympathetic to their cause. And by killing him, he would have become the emperor 2 years later when Franz Joseph died. They would have actually probably been in a situation much more favorable than the one they were currently in.
But today, that decision ended up putting him in the crosshairs of his fellow nationalists who only saw a uniform. Despite being repulsed at Dublin Castle, the rebels captured fortifications elsewhere. A group seized the magazine fort in Phoenix Park, which they pillaged for weapons and then partially demolished with explosives. The blast echoed across the city, but was not as impressive as the nationalists hoped. Across Dublin, the volunteers set to work, turning buildings into strongholds. They constructed barricades, stockpiled food and ammunition, cleared firing lanes, and erected medical stations.
So they've obviously been working on this for some time. They've laid out their plans. They've decided these are the areas we need to take. These are the things we're going to need. We're going to, they're thinking down the road several steps ahead, which is what you want to do. If this is purely a reactionary thing, people don't think of those things. So this seems to be relatively well thought out. But of course, no plan survives contact with the enemy, in this case, the enemy being the British government. So you don't know necessarily what they're going to do.
To nullify the British authorities' advantage in communications and transport, they cut phone and telegraph lines and bombed railroad tracks. All this dynamism among the rebels was a stark contrast to the lethargy of Dublin's small, largely reservist army garrison. 2 squadrons of cavalry rode into the city center to investigate reports of disruption, but were forced to quickly retreat. Most British commanders ordered their soldiers to stay in their barracks as they tried to piece together exactly what was happening.
Smart.
The sharpest fighting on that first day occurred outside the South Dublin Union, when a patrol from the British Army's Royal Irish Regiment encountered a volunteers' outpost set up just east of the Union workhouse. After multiple soldiers dropped from rebel gunfire, the soldiers stormed the nationalist position and captured it, yet the Union complex itself stayed in the hands of the volunteers.
Interesting that the Union workhouse becomes kind of a focal point of all this. A workhouse is, there's no real equivalent to it in the United States that I could really compare for an American audience, but basically what it is was it was a place for people to go who had nowhere else to go. Almost like a combination homeless shelter and retirement home, nursing home type of thing. But it was a place that was intentionally difficult because what they didn't want was people to just kind of go there as an easy out, right? So if you went there because you had nowhere else to go, because you were poor, because you were homeless, You had to work hard. You were expected to do a lot. The conditions were intentionally really poor so that nobody wanted to be there. But the only people who were there were people who just simply had nowhere else to go.
During the fighting, the soldiers killed a nurse, despite the fact that she was in uniform and clearly a non-combatant.
Wow.
As the sun began to set on the first day, a strange quiet settled over the streets. A rebellion was clearly underway, but the sounds and fury of battle hadn't yet gripped the city. It was almost as though Dubliners had slept through the chaos, though that would soon change. While the volunteers had taken many of their initial objectives, they hadn't been wholly successful. No effort had been made to capture Dublin's twin ports, and the train stations were only briefly under rebel control, meaning the British government could funnel in reinforcements at will.
So yeah, I mean, the ports and the train station, those are two huge components when you're dealing with a large empire that you know has the resources to crush you. You have to secure those things. You cannot give them an easy way to bring in troops and supplies that they're going to need. And you have to move quickly enough that you can make this into a popular uprising, because a small group in one city is not going to stand up to even a distracted version of the British Empire. So you've got to move quick, and you've got to get people on your side, and you've got to do that before they can move these guys in.
Similarly, no one thought to capture the telephone exchange. And once staff evicted from the General Post Office repaired the cut lines, they managed to reestablish communications with the government. So as darkness fell, the nationalists steeled themselves. They'd played their hand and now had no option but to fight. The Shelburne Hotel, April 25th, 1916. The scrape of hobnailed boots echo in the halls, scuffing up the hotel's carpets. British soldiers, newly arrived into the city, usher out the remaining guests and start arming the hotel like a fortress, as well as the neighboring United Services Club. They position sharpshooters and machine gun teams in windows, looking down on the detachment of rebels that have dug in on St. Stephen's Green, and wait for the order to fire. The crack of British Lee Enfield rifles split the dawn. Machine guns rained shots on the green. The nationalists, members of the Irish Citizen Army, return the serve, and soon a firefight rages. Bullets whipping through branches and into tree trunks in the park, and chewing at the stonework of the hotel facade. But the British soldiers have the advantage of height and stone buildings for cover. They drive the rebels from their hastily constructed trenches, and groups of Irish Citizen Army fighters fall back, dragging their wounded with them, though they continue to resist. And this clash is not the only one to rip the morning apart. All across the city, gunfire rises to a crescendo that eclipses the previous day's skirmishing. It was in these early hours of Tuesday morning that the British Army's senior commander, Brigadier General William Lowe, arrived. After a period of early confusion and inactivity, Lowe had decided to personally take a hand in the situation. He summoned reinforcements from across Ireland and mainland Britain.
And see, that's the problem. I'm curious to know what their end game was. I mean, I have to think that they were hoping it would cause a popular uprising. You know, I think of John Brown, right? In 1859, he storms this armory in Harper's Ferry to get a bunch of weapons, hoping that they can create a slave uprising in Virginia that would spread, right? That was his end game. That was his plan. What was their plan here? Their plan could not have been simply seize a bunch of key points and then wait for the British Army to show up and take it all back. I mean, there had to have been more to it than that. So I looked it up, and it does appear that these risings weren't only happening in Dublin. They were happening in other key cities as well. You might have had 60 people in one spot, a couple hundred in another. And so they did attempt to kind of do this everywhere. So it makes a little more sense. I still don't know exactly what they thought was going to happen. They had to know the British were going to respond in a pretty heavy-handed way.
And planned multiple counterattacks, like the one at St. Stephen's Green. Lowe also deployed an armored train to repair a set of rail tracks that had been damaged by explosives, but the rebels engaged it in a furious 2-hour gun battle at a bridge crossing, forcing the armored behemoth to retreat. But that victory was short-lived. For later in the day, the rebels' fortunes changed in an instant, with a sound that rattled windows throughout the city. Now, before the rising, rebel leaders had reasoned that the British Army wouldn't be permitted to use heavy artillery within the city of Dublin. A capitalist government, James Connolly said, will never destroy property. However, at this moment, the British Army quickly proved him wrong. 4 artillery pieces, 18-pounders, the same type used in the trenches of the Western Front, opened fire in a city full of civilians.
So you got to remember, I think this was a miscalculation on their part. This is 1916. The Great War's been going on for over 2 years. They've seen plenty of cities completely destroyed by artillery. It's also a war in which the majority of battle casualties were caused with artillery. The British Army understood the importance of artillery and how powerful it could be, and they weren't messing around.
First, they shelled an Irish volunteer position thrown up in a residential neighborhood of northwest Dublin. Stunned by the sudden, ferocious barrage, the nationalists fell back, shrapnel and debris raining down around them.
I will say this, and I wonder if, this is me totally speculating here, I wonder if the leaders of the Irish Rising understood, maybe, even if they didn't speak it out loud, that the British would use artillery, and then maybe saw this as an avenue through which they would win more public support to their side. By the British doing this, maybe some people who were otherwise on the fence get pushed off the fence because they see civilians getting shelled by artillery, and it pushes them to the cause of the Irish nationalists. I don't know.
In the afternoon, Pearse left the General Post Office again and walked to nearby Nelson Pillar, a Dublin landmark dedicated to the British Admiral. And there, he read an address to the gathering crowd. Now was the time, he said. Now was the moment that would make or break not just the Rising, but the fate of the longed-for republic. And he called upon those listening to rise up in support of the rebellion. Almost none heeded him.
And there's your turning point, right? This all only works if the people rise up. If everybody turns against the British government, because it's never going to work if it's just a couple of hundred or 1,000 or 2,000 people. It's got to be the nation. And if they don't rise up, now you're kind of at a standstill. Same thing with the, I think it's 1832, the one in France that's commemorated in the musical Les Miserables. You know, this was a young group of students who rose up during a funeral thinking that the whole city would rise up with them, and it didn't happen, and they ended up instead being in small pockets, barricaded in city streets, defending to the last. And that's where this is headed now, too.
The people of Dublin had not anticipated the events of the past 24 hours, and most, it seemed, wanted no part in it. In fact, some were outright hostile. Civilians harangued the volunteers and attempted to dismantle their barricades, resulting in rebels opening fire and killing several of them. At Trinity College, the students armed themselves to resist the Irish nationalists and provide a base of operation for the British when they arrived, and Guinness employees turned their brewery trucks over to the British Army so it could use them as makeshift armored vehicles in the coming street fights. And others took advantage of the chaos by indulging in a spree of shop looting, especially in the aptly named Sackville Street. By the end of Tuesday, it was clear that there would be no general uprising, not in Dublin and not anywhere else. The volunteers were on their own, and with most seeing the end approaching, they decided to fight to the last. But little did anyone know, the worst for Dublin was yet to come. Once again.
So that's got to be disheartening if you believe in a cause strongly and you feel like everyone believes in it too, or else they're just waiting for someone to lead, and once you lead, they'll follow, and then they don't. And now you realize that it's life or death and that there's no way out of this for you. That's got to be disheartening. It's got to be disillusioning for you a little bit. So it's interesting to see this unfold this way. And because, I kind of know the end game of all of this, but I don't know all the steps along the way. So I'm learning a lot here, and that's why I'm kind of just throwing out speculation, because I'm seeing how close I am to guessing how this is playing out. But interesting stuff. We've got 2 more episodes that are out, so we'll do those over the next 2 days. I'm headed to Denver. My wife and I are headed to Denver on Thursday. This weekend, I will be announcing more details of it, but I've been asked not to reveal those details yet. But this weekend, there will be a chance for you to meet not only myself, but Mr. Beat, Drew Durnall, some others are going to be there, and we'll be announcing that, but there will be like a fan meetup type of thing happening in Denver this weekend. So if you happen to be in the Denver area, be watching. I will post an announcement about that in the next couple of days when we get a little closer. I've been just asked not to do that until we get closer to it. So tell you the time and place and everything. All right, thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon. Welcome back, everyone, to part 4 of our look at the story of the Easter Rising through the eyes of extra history. If you have not seen the first 3 parts of my reaction, the link is in the description, as well as the link to the original content. Please make sure to give them a subscribe and check out all of their fantastic history content. They've got a lot of other non-history stuff as well, but I'm a history guy, so that's what I do. Let's go ahead and dive into part 4.
North King Street, Dublin, Ireland, April 26th, 1916. Crouched behind captured barricades, a British officer issues the order every soldier dreads. Fix bayonets! His platoon complies, sliding the long blades onto their Lee Enfield rifles. A momentary pause as the soldiers wait, collecting their courage. Charge! Shouting, the British surge over the barricades and up the street. Rifle fire booms from the tall, tightly packed buildings surrounding them and blasts out from a barricaded pub. The officer leading the charge takes a bullet. His men drop, killed or wounded. The attack lasts mere seconds, as without cover, the soldiers are easy targets for the Irish nationalists sheltering behind the street barricades.
I mean, this fits perfectly with the time period, right? This is the middle of World War I, and if anybody knows anything about charging over open ground against entrenched, well-defended opponents, it's the British Army, because they're about to do the same stupid thing at the Somme. Not that the other armies don't do it as well, but this is a time period. They're starting to get away from it, but this is a time period in history where there's an idea called the cult of the offensive. Now, granted, we're not talking about massive armies here. We're talking about small group tactics, but the idea was, in most cases, that it was always better to attack. Even if your opponent was defending in strong position, attacking was always better. And if you were defending, it was better to counterattack as quickly as possible. So, this is the British Army. They think this is a bunch of rebels. How hard could it be? We're just going to charge in there. We're going to deal with them. They're going to figure out pretty quickly that it's not the way to go.
The survivors withdraw. Wasting no time, a few nationalists, desperate to replenish their supplies, leap from cover to grab weapons and ammunition from the slain. And they'll need every round, for blood is now trickling into the gutters of North King Street. And as more men give their lives for the conflict, and more civilians find themselves caught in the crossfire, that trickle soon swells to a torrent. This episode is brought to you by, well, you, our lovely patrons over at Patreon. To hear about how you can vote on history topics we make shows about, and some pretty neat new stuff in the EC merch store, please stay tuned until after the episode. 2 days after the start of the Easter Rising, British efforts were focused on isolating and crushing small Irish nationalist enclaves that had dug in throughout Dublin city centre. The Four Courts and neighbouring North King Street, where the British launched their doomed bayonet charge, was one such rebel stronghold. The area was a tangle of slum housing and narrow streets and alleys, a nightmare for any attacker. So the British mostly tried to tunnel through walls, going from one building into the next, rather than risk the open street.
Makes sense.
Nationalists fired from windows and rooftops, or from behind their barricades, some moving from house to house to ensure they kept the element of surprise.
So yesterday we talked about how the British Army had used their 18-inch artillery, and how, or 18-pound artillery, not 18-inch. My goodness, that'd be enormous. They did have shells like that in the Great War, but not here. But we talked about that, and when you're dealing with this kind of a situation where it's guerrilla warfare, where you're dealing with a small, very mobile enemy who's on rooftops and in windows and in buildings, it doesn't take very long if you're an army with superior firepower to say, you know what, forget this. We're not losing our men charging through city streets and getting picked off one by one. Bring in the artillery. So I totally get why they would have resorted to that.
And the British claimed that when cornered, the rebels would throw away their weapons and pretend to be civilians, even going so far as to use women as shields. Now, this may have been true, or it may have simply been a justification to excuse what happened next.
And I'll say this, whenever, and we talk about this all the time, when you're dealing with conflicting sources, where you're dealing with sources, period, it's always important to ask a bunch of questions. Like, number one, are they in a position to know this information? Like, did they witness it firsthand, or are they hearing it from someone else? What is their bias? What is their agenda? So if you've got British soldiers saying they were using these people as human shields, it doesn't mean you automatically dismiss it and say it's not true, but you have to say, you know what, if they killed some civilians, that's probably what they would say. is that they were using them as human shields. And the other side would say, well, we definitely weren't doing that. They were just murdering civilians. And more than likely, it's somewhere in between. There's probably a mix of both.
Or it might have been both. By Friday, the bloodshed around the four courts still showed no sign of ending. And furious at the casualties sustained, British soldiers burst into a series of homes late Friday night. In an event that became known as the North King Street Massacre, they shot or bayoneted 15 unarmed men, none of whom were taking part in the rising. Such were the realities of rebellion for the nation.
But these are the kinds of things that push people to the other side, people who were in the middle. We talked about this yesterday. People who really didn't take sides suddenly find themselves saying, wow, maybe they're right about the British. Maybe we do need independence. Maybe it's time to take a side. So while this rising itself may not be successful, if it pushes thousands more people to your side, then maybe it's worth it long term.
Nationalists, North King Street was just another example of British brutality, added to centuries of oppression and injustice. And to the British, North King Street was the inevitable result of the nationalists intentionally blurring the lines between soldiers and civilians, thus bringing death and ruination down upon their own people. And as the uprising raged on, many Dubliners actually shared that British view.
And you know, of course they called it the King Street Massacre, just like there was a Boston Massacre in the 1770s in the United States, or what became the United States. And your side is always going to use this as propaganda, right? So look at the evil British and what they did to a bunch of civilians. It's probably more complicated than that. In the case of I don't know the details here, but in the case of the Boston Massacre, it was 5 civilians who were probably in a mob that was threatening armed British soldiers who were protecting the State House, who were throwing things at them, rocks, ice, some of them carrying clubs. They wanted a confrontation. They wanted this to happen so they could turn around and use it, and that's exactly what happened. I'm not saying that that's the case here, but I'm saying that this stuff can be used in a positive way for your side.
They saw the rising as a betrayal of the homeland, especially since hundreds of thousands of Irishmen, including Irish nationalists, were giving their lives in the struggle overseas against Imperial Germany. But regardless, as the brutal fighting near the Four Courts dragged on, it quickly became clear that it would not be the bloodiest engagement that day. Northumberland Road, Dublin, Ireland, that same day. A column of British soldiers march along the street through a leafy, well-to-do part of Dublin. They are reinforcements heading into the city. Fresh troops, newly arrived from London, and most just out of basic training. One man, Adjutant Captain Frederick Christian Dietrichson, briefly falls out of ranks to greet a woman and 2 children. They are Dietrichson's wife, son, and daughter. The captain had sent for them from London, moving them to Ireland in hopes to avoid the threat of German Zeppelin bombings. He could have never imagined an even greater danger awaited them here.
So what he's talking about there with the Zeppelin bombings is the Zeppelins, think Hindenburg. We call them blimps here in America now. They're flying them over the channel and they're bombing cities. I mean, they're bombing Scotland, they're bombing England. They're dropping these bombs, and it's kind of a World War I version of the Blitz that's going to happen in World War II. It's not nearly to the level, but it's something new in warfare. Airplanes have only existed for like 10 years. Now, these aren't airplanes, but the idea of air power in warfare is a very new thing. So understandable for him to want to move his family away from that, much like people did in World War II, moving their families out of the cities.
But for now, he's relieved to see that his family is safe. And they, for their part, will never see him again. Ugh. Just a few minutes later, Dietrichson and 9 other soldiers die in a rebel ambush not far from Mount Street Bridge. Caught in the open, the inexperienced soldiers suffer terrible losses, and rather than retreat, they're ordered to press on. So they did, marching directly into a disaster. At Mount Street Bridge, spanning the Grand Canal, those British reinforcements struggled against a small detachment of dug-in rebels. Ill-equipped and inexperienced, they suffered 216 casualties,
Jeez.
Accounting for 2/3 of all of the British Army losses during the Rising. In addition, around 20 civilians were also killed or wounded, while trying to help fallen British soldiers caught in the open. Elsewhere, at the
That is to say, nobody's clean in all of this, right? Both sides have killed civilians. Both sides have done things that shouldn't be praised. This is the kind of ugliness that happens, especially in what you can call a civil war in this case, a revolution, an attempted revolution. Things get ugly and people die in the crossfire. Brutal.
Mendicity Institution Charity Building, 26 Irish volunteers made a stand against repeated British assaults. Enduring sniper fire and a hail of bullets from machine guns, the outpost continued to resist until they ran out of ammunition. And this was just one of many similar incidents across the city. For the nationalists, fighting from the Northumberland Hotel to the South Dublin Union, all of whom had resolved to take up arms despite the odds, this rising was the ultimate moment of reckoning, the struggle they believed they had inherited from their forefathers. Further west, at the South Dublin Union, more brutal close combat played out. The fighting went from building to building, and room to room, as the British attempted to pry the rebels from their positions. Some of the structures in the complex were taken, but others remained in the hands of the volunteers. The rebels fought for every inch. And when one nationalist officer was severely wounded, he ordered his men to leave him behind, while he continued to fight on, alone, armed only with his pistol. Though frontal assaults were the order of the day in some parts of the city, in others, the nationalists were instead subjected to ranged bombardment. British artillery opened fire on Wednesday from Trinity College and Phibsborough, supported by a gunboat that had sailed up the River Liffey. The relentless shelling killed volunteers and civilians alike, and kept most of the rebels pinned down. In a matter of days, the grand architecture of several Dublin neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Meanwhile, outside Dublin, counter orders had ensured that most of the Irish volunteers beyond the city stayed at home. Others mustered but didn't engage in combat. And in Cork, Roman Catholic clergy successfully persuaded the volunteers to surrender their weapons to the British Army. Though elsewhere, a few chose to ignore their directives.
So what you're dealing with then is you're dealing with a very disjointed, not well coordinated rising that's happening. And this is the problem anytime you're dealing with going up against a formidable, well-supplied, well-equipped, well-led force like the British Army. You can't really match them in terms of organization and leadership. And you're seeing the failing of that here, where you've got some people rising up and others being talked into not rising, or maybe changing their mind. And it's just, it needed to go perfectly. It needed everything to go in their way. They needed people to rise up. That didn't happen. They didn't even get all the people who were already signed up to be a part of this to rise up the way that they should. So it was doomed to fail.
And fight anyway. The largest entanglement outside Dublin occurred to the north of the city, where an Irish volunteer battalion convinced a string of Royal Irish Constabulary stations to surrender. The last one did so only after a 5-hour-long firefight that left 8 policemen and 5 volunteers dead. Despite this, there was still next to no support for the uprising from the general Irish populace. So the success or failure of the rising would ultimately hinge on the events playing out in Dublin. Sackville Street, April 29th, 1916. The General Post Office is in flames, its ruins blazing, as a pale of black smoke joins the dozens of smudges already blotting the Dublin skyline. However, the structure is mercifully abandoned. The nationalist leadership who fought from it have evacuated at the last minute, tunneling through walls to escape the all-consuming fire. They set up a new command post in nearby Moore Street. Every one of them, from the newest volunteer right up the chain of command to Pierce himself, is exhausted. Some are wounded, some dying. James Connolly has taken a bullet to the leg. Food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies, all of it is almost gone.
Now they're done.
The volunteers called, but Ireland has not answered. They have no more left to give. Pierce knows that...
And what's that do to you psychologically, right? When you believe in your cause and you are willing to die for it, you obviously are all in, heart, soul, spirit. And you're convinced that other people will rise up if they are just led, if they're just inspired. And then when you do this and you start watching the guys that you've worked toward this with die around you, and the rising doesn't happen, that's got to be devastating to you psychologically. And I wonder how they dealt with that.
The cost to the city has already been appalling, and fighting to the death will only lead to more civilian casualties. So reluctantly, he orders his men to lay down their arms and sends a message to the British asking for terms. The Easter Rising is over. Pearse, Connolly, and the other leaders of the uprising in Dublin are taken into captivity. It takes a few days for the surrender orders to reach the various pockets of rebel resistance, and after the high emotion and intense combat, many are reluctant to give up their weapons.
And I will say this, the decision to surrender in that situation because you see all the death that's happening you got to say it's kind of selfless if you're one of the leaders, because you have to know the chances are really good that they're going to execute you. But you're probably counting on the fact, well, maybe they'll execute me, but that doesn't mean they'll execute everybody else. And maybe I'm still saving lives in the end.
This had been their chance, their moment to change the history of their country and avenge centuries of oppression. And yet, they'd failed. When the last of them finally submitted, the cost of the uprising became clear. At the final count, 126 British soldiers, including 35 from Irish regiments, had been killed along with 17 policemen, and among the nationalists, 66 had died. But the greatest number of dead were the civilians, 260 in all, with thousands more wounded.
More civilians died than all of the combatants combined. You're looking at 143, 209 total between police, British Army, and Irish nationalists, but it's the civilians who pay, and that's usually the way it is.
Parts of Dublin were in ruins from shelling, and smoke continued to cloud the sky for days. But while the fighting may have been over, the dying hadn't yet run its course. Because in defeat, the Easter Rising and the British response to it would serve as a fault line that would break Ireland apart. One of the main reasons...
All right, well, I think we've got one more episode to go. So we'll deal with that tomorrow. I'm actually going to record it later today because my wife and I are off to Denver tomorrow. Also be posting tomorrow some announcements concerning the trip to Denver and also when you can expect for a stream to talk about my recent trip to Europe. So all of that's coming. If you'd hit that like button, leave a comment, I'd appreciate it. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, to episode 5 of our look at the story of the Easter Rising in 1916. I believe this is the final episode. At least it's the final one that's been released so far. I guess we'll see if there's a part 6, but I think this is it. Anyway, by the time you guys are watching this, Mrs. VTH and I will be somewhere over the Great Plains of the United States on our way to Denver for the weekend. Be watching for a separate video that'll give you the information about the meetup opportunity that's happening this weekend. We're going to be a part of a big group of educational YouTubers, history YouTubers, specifically some of, not all, our history, that are going to be there. And you'll have a chance to not only meet me and the missus, but also many of them. So last I knew, Cynical Historian's going to be there, Genia Vlogger, Tim from Drawn of History, Drew Durnall, myself, Mr. Beat, Will from Knowing Better, Arvin Ash, Grant from Casual Historian, Willie from Canubis, Kalen, Atlas Pro. I think that's pretty much everybody. Kristen from Molecular Memory, and Julian O'Shea. So that was the list last I was aware. So assuming they're all still coming, but there is going to be a meetup this weekend for all of us. And you have a chance to meet any and all of us that you wish to, but I'll post a separate video about that. But let's go ahead and dive in to part 5. As always, the link is in the description if you haven't seen the first 4 episodes. And if you want to watch it without my commentary, at the very least, go over, give them a like, leave them a comment, and let them know that you're supporting what it is that they are doing. Let's go ahead and dive in to the last part.
Dublin, Ireland, May 3rd, 1916. It's so early in the morning, it's still dark outside. Patrick Pearse sits in his cell, quiet and contemplative, and he's just finished writing final letters to his mother and brother. A Roman Catholic priest is admitted by the guards, and Pearse bows his head to receive last rites. Shortly after, more soldiers arrive to escort him outside. He then marches to the end of the jail yard, a narrow space hemmed in by high, rough stone walls. He is then blindfolded, and a white marker tied around his chest. The execution detail lines up 12 steps away. Pearse faces them, and the orders ring out. Ready! Aim! Fire!
Now, I actually just did a podcast that went live today about military executions during the First World War, because I went to the site of some of those executions in the town of Poppering in Belgium, and I visited a cemetery where more British military executed bodies lie than any other cemetery on the Western Front. There's 17 of them in the Poppering New Cemetery, so I'll have a video coming about that as well. But typically, I can't say for sure if it was done the same way with these Irish rebels, but typically it would have been a team of 12 enlisted men. They would have laid down their rifles and been marched off, while an officer would then load 10 of the 12 with live rounds, 2 with blanks, and then they would bring them back in, give them to order the fire, and then afterwards either the sergeant that was a part of that squad or an officer would do what they call the coup de grace and put a bullet in the head of the condemned to make sure they were dead. I don't know about tying a white something all the way around their entire body, but they typically would pin a white handkerchief over the heart as a place for them to aim.
In a nearby cell, Patrick Pierce's younger brother William hears the echoing report of his brother's execution. In less than 24 hours, he will stand in the same spot and suffer the same fate. Thanks so much to HelloFresh for continuing to help us bring history to the table. In the aftermath of the Easter Rising, British authorities arrested thousands of Irish nationalists. Crowds of Dubliners jeered as some British soldiers led them off, calling them murderers for the bloodshed they brought into the city streets. Army courts tried a total of 187 nationalists in legal proceedings that broke a number of British laws. They were held in private, without allowing the accused any legal defense, and some of the military officers serving as judges had even fought against the Rising.
So, not surprised by that. Same thing happened in the United States in the aftermath of the American Civil War. Military tribunals to try civilians, even though courts ruled you can't do that sort of thing, and there were all kinds of reasons why it was not okay. In the midst of rebellion, people tend to look the other way at the government doing things that it shouldn't normally be allowed to do. And it seems like that was the case. See, I'm not trying to justify it or anything like that. I'm just saying this is a pretty common thing that powerful governments do in the aftermath of rebellion. They tend to bend, if not completely break, the law in how they deal with it.
Due to the imposition of martial law, the British military commander in Ireland, General Sir John Maxwell, knew he'd be able to punish the rebels with impunity. He was assisted in this by General Charles Blackadder, and both men were determined to punish the nationalists as swiftly as possible, regardless of public opinion or even the will of the government. Of the 187 men tried, 90 were sentenced to death, 75 of which eventually had their sentences commuted, but 14 suffered the ultimate punishment, with firing squads conducting the grim work in the yard of Kilmainham Jail. Patrick.
I think there was one guy who was sentenced to death, but the sentence wasn't carried out because he was an American citizen, and they didn't want to tick off the Americans, I think.
Pierce was shot on the first day of the executions. 2 other nationalists died within minutes of him, and 4 others, including William Pierce, were shot the day after. And for 5 days, between May 3rd and May 12th, the rifles boomed, with each of the rebels facing death without flinching. Now, Maxwell claimed that only the ringleaders of the Rising and those who had killed in cold blood were executed, but that wasn't entirely true. William Pierce, for example, had only worked as his brother's aide, had not been involved in planning or leading the rebellion, nor had he killed anyone. Nevertheless, he suffered his brother's fate. As the executions continued, the public's mood began to markedly change. Apathy toward the...
See, I'm sure there was a reason why they did them a few at a time instead of all at once, but I can see why that would backfire. Like, do it all at once, get it out of the way, and then maybe public opinion doesn't turn against it, but day after day after day, it's in the news. 3 more. And maybe that's why they did it that way. Maybe that's what they were hoping for, was to keep it in the news, to really press home, don't do this. So maybe it was intentional and it backfired. I don't know.
The Rising was replaced by dismay at the military's actions, both in suppressing the revolt and the clearly unfair trials. Stoked by international pressure and members of the press sympathetic to the nationalist cause, this unrest quickly swelled into a fury. While most of Ireland hadn't wished to take up armed struggle, there was still widespread sympathy for the nationalist cause, and this rapidly translated into sympathy for these failed rebels. On the other side of things, the British government was similarly concerned with General Maxwell's handling of the affair, because it was feared that as they killed the rebels one by one, the leaders of this rising were being transmuted into martyrs. Meeting in death, the rebellion.
There's something to be said for showing lenience in that situation. And had that happened maybe a few decades later, maybe that would have been the case, but it certainly wasn't the case at this time. During a time of war already, I can't imagine the British government handling this any other way, but you can see how maybe in the end creating martyrs out of them would be a problem.
And its leaders were achieving what they'd failed to do in life, rousing Ireland to rebellion. By May 12th, even Unionist Irish politicians were calling for the executions to stop. On that day, James Connolly faced the firing squad, the 14th nationalist to do so. And, due to public pressure, he would be the last, at least for the time being. But as the echoes of that final rifle volley faded within Kilmainham's stone walls, the silence left suggested not an ending, but a new beginning. In August, the diplomat Roger Casement was also sentenced to death. Despite not having taken up arms himself in the Rising, his work procuring weapons and recruits in America and Germany saw him convicted of treason. Oddly enough, an obscure legal loophole relating to the placement of a specific comma in a statute was used to ensure a death sentence, to which Casement commented wryly that he was to be hanged on a comma. He was executed August 3rd. In the aftermath of these executions, one group quickly moved to harness this general sense of anger and injustice and tie it to specific political goals. The Sinn Fein party had been founded in 1905 as a moderate nationalist party. Originally,
interesting, Sinn Fein is seen as the moderate nationalist party because in decades to come, they're going to be seen as one of the more radical parties.
They'd advocated for an Ireland that was independent from Great Britain, but that also remained part of the British Empire, retaining the monarchy. But by 1916...
And there's precedent for that. I mean, look at Australia, New Zealand, Canada. They all have retained, my darn chair, they've all retained the monarchy, but have their own government. And there's talk that if Scotland goes ahead and breaks away from the United Kingdom, that they would go back basically to the status they had before the 1700s, where they were under a joint union of the crown, but a separate government.
Both the attitude and goals of the party had changed. Many members of the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Republican Brotherhood were also members of Sinn Féin, and the party was seen, wrongly to an extent, as the driving force behind militant republicanism. So Sinn Féin chose to capitalize on this misconception, and in 1917, they pivoted to an avowedly Republican stance, a move for which they were awarded with victory of 73 out of Ireland's 105 parliamentary seats in the 1918 general election. And for some, the victory of a Republican Party was a green light to take up arms once again. Near Ballyvorney, Ireland, July 7th, 1918.
So again, context here. We are in the final months of the Great War, World War I. July 7th is right on the heels of what was known as the Kaiserschlacht offensive, the spring offensive by the Germans. It was the Germans' last-ditch effort to take Paris, to divide the British and French armies, and force a negotiated settlement before the Americans can arrive in force, because the Americans are arriving tens of thousands at a time, and they're very quickly building up to where the Americans are going to have 1 million or 2 men on the Western Front. And so the Germans are trying to end the war as quickly as they can, but this has fizzled out by this point, and now you're about to get an Allied offensive that's called the 100 Days Offensive that's going to kind of seal the victory. So we're right at about that time where that's going to start happening.
Sunlight dapples the Irish countryside as two policemen of the Royal Irish Constabulary walk along a quiet lane. They've just left the village of Ballyvorney, having attempted to stop an illegal gathering. But as they pass through the mouth of the glen, gunshots ring out. Several figures leap from the surrounding hedgerows and assail the two policemen. One is shot in the neck, the other is thrown into the dirt and beaten. His attackers identify themselves as Irish Volunteers. The Nationalists take the carbines and ammunition carried by the police and leave them in the roadway. And this is only the beginning, for the Easter Rising may be in the past, but after the executions and the rise of Sinn Féin, the nationalist cause has never been stronger. That ambush was the first time the Nationalists had fired on the police since the end of the Rising, and it signaled further violence ahead. Buoyed by election success, Sinn Fein and its adherents prepared for an armed uprising that would eclipse that of 1916.
So it's interesting to see that they're resorting to violence because they've made political success. And I'm sure there were probably people within the government there who were saying, listen, let us do this in a different way. Let's try and win the people to our side politically. But maybe they thought that they needed the extra pressure and that both political and in a way of violence was going to be the means by which they would achieve this.
In early 1919, an uprising that became known as the Irish War of Independence flared throughout Ireland.
And at this point now you're talking about the outbreak of Spanish flu, right? By the time we're into 1919, I don't know if they'll touch on that at all, but that's going to add to all of this, is that you're dealing with a worldwide pandemic that killed maybe as much as 5% of the world's population.
Nationalists waged a guerrilla campaign, resulting in around 2,300 dead, nearly half of them civilians.
Wow.
But despite the British government responding with aggressive tactics, it soon became clear that this time, Ireland would have to be granted its independence. Though less than a year later, a second war was raging, this one a civil war among Irish nationalists. One faction consisted of Republicans, while the other comprised those who wanted Ireland to remain part of the British Empire, even though by then it was no longer part of the United Kingdom.
So it's interesting to see that happen, because this is a pretty common thing that happens, is once you've dealt with the enemy that you all agree on, now those factions that we saw all the way back at the beginning are now fighting with each other. Same thing's happening at this point in Russia. You've got the Bolsheviks fighting, against the people who want to have a democratic government. So you've got communism, democracy. They all worked to overthrow the monarchy that existed, but now they're fighting about what's our future going to look like.
And after a year of fighting that proved just as bloody as the War of Independence, the Republicans were defeated and the Irish Free State born. In the aftermath of all of that conflict, the Easter Rising itself remains difficult to categorize. To some, it was nothing less than the realization of centuries of struggle against imperial domination. Often rhetorically intertwined with the Roman Catholic symbolism of Easter, it's seen as a righteous rebellion by brave men who fought to the end and whose martyrdom paved the way for Irish independence. But there's also an opposite view, which holds that the rebellion itself was unnecessary. Ireland had been working its way steadily towards self-determination, and it seemed likely that independence could have been achieved, eventually, without resorting to widespread bloodshed. Even some Republicans have viewed the likes of James Connolly as akin to a hate preacher who brought violence down on the people of Dublin, and prior to the execution.
So I'm curious, those of you who follow this channel who live in Ireland, how are these people viewed today? How is all of this viewed by the people that you know? How do you view it? I would love to hear from some of our Irish followers to know what the view of all of this is today.
Ireland's apathy toward the Rising showed that there was little appetite then for armed struggle. As is so often the case, the truth is complex, and attitudes in Ireland toward the Rising have swayed back and forth over the past century. Sometimes it's an anniversary that has been commemorated and celebrated, while at other times it's been regulated to a minor remembrance. But perhaps the Rising's violent legacy is best understood through a single...
Did he say it's been regulated? I think he probably meant relegated. I don't know. I do that all the time, guys. We all say words we didn't mean. We all read things wrong. We all make mistakes. I'm not making a big deal of it because I do it probably at least once a video.
Bloody incident. On April 26, 1916, while fighting raged in Dublin, a British officer, Captain John Bowen Colthurst, had 6 civilians murdered. Colthurst, a veteran of the Boer War and World War I, who may have been suffering from PTSD, claimed that he thought the cold-blooded executions were, quote, the right thing to do. He was later arrested, but escaped long-term punishment with an insanity plea. Now, the widow of one of his victims described Colthurst as the Englishman with the veneer removed. But here's the thing. Colthurst wasn't English. He was an Irishman born and raised in Cork. Such incidents serve as a stark reminder of what can happen during times of revolution and the harsh realities that are often left out of founding myths. For while many Irishmen and women were willing to fight and die for their independence from Britain, tragically, many of the people they fought were often their own. Well, Zoe,
that was good stuff. I I confess I don't know nearly enough about Irish history, and I've got Irish roots like a lot of Americans do. Definitely hope to get an opportunity to visit both Ireland and Northern Ireland someday. But yeah, I would love to hear, especially from you folks who live in Ireland, how is this stuff viewed today? Let me know in the comment section below, and be watching for my latest video from Antietam, which is a companion to JD at the History Underground, his video about the sunken lane. I'll be showing the Union perspective for that, and be watching for the announcement about the get-together this weekend. And you might see some stuff either on Instagram or here on the channel that we might do together, me and all the folks that are going to be getting together this weekend. So hopefully we'll see that soon. Thanks for watching.